Protests are one of my least favorite forms of activism, not because of how violent it is or how rowdy it is or the fact that I have to go out, but because of how volatile it is and how easily the purpose, the reason for why we're out there in the first place can get away from us. Now, let's start with what it is, right? It's a public declaration of our position. There's usually an intent behind the protest. Something happens, someone dies, someone gets kidnapped. Just basically something wrong happens in society that just triggers a mass reaction, kind of like dominoes. And then the next thing you know, a bunch of people are out on the streets protesting a particular action, seeking for a particular kind of action to be given, or rather to be made by the government or whatever society whatever interests you're protesting against, right? That's usually what protests are. And I feel like in their own way, they're a huge form of communication, because you see the numbers, you see the things that are being written on the placards, and then whatever circulates online, right? Whatever message protesters are putting forward serve as a form of communication that, look, this is what we do not want in a particular situation, and they would repeat these things over and over again. So they're a beautiful form of communication, but as to whether or not they're effective and some of the disadvantages that they have, let's dive into that. The first thing I will say is that it is not enough, because protests are usually an expression of how we feel about a certain issue, right? We're coming out and we're saying we didn't like this and we wanted to respond this way. And so one of the problems I have with this is how unclear some protests might be. The fact that the people in power that we want actual change from, the people that we're protesting against, the people that we go into the streets to yell at and say, look, this wasn't good, those people will not respond to feelings. They only respond to some form of consequence, right? Be it economical, be it like physical. They respond when there is something being taken from them to such an extent that they are forced to act. And usually protests that are simple-minded, right? They do not achieve this goal. They are simply just people out in the streets. For example, when we did the bad governance protest, right? People were coming out on the streets and they were talking about how, look, this is our position, this is where we stand, and this is what we want, right? But did it work? Did bad governance end? It did not end. And in cases like that, what the government just did was ride the protest out. You guys should continue protesting. They will send in police here and there in order to curb protesters whenever they try to attack buildings or anything like that. Now, on the issue of attacking buildings, this is another reason, or rather problem I have with protests, the fact that it can get away from the actual original protesters. Now, in my experience, from what I've seen, most protests are done with good intent, and most protesters want it to be a peaceful protest, right? A lot of protesters want it this way. But there are times when, as a form of like method for sabotage, the government or whichever interest you're protesting against can actually introduce people into that protest that would carry out disruptive activities, right? This is a possibility, and it's something that has happened in the past. They would be disruptive on several occasions. They would pretend to be protesters. And then that form of protest now is a method through which the protests themselves can be discredited. Let me make this clear. Peaceful protest is usually the goal. Peaceful protest is what most people want, right? Because it's clear, you clearly communicate your feelings, and we're not trying to be anarchists, right? But in the event that any form of violence is being perpetrated by the protesters, the intent behind the protest can often be miscued. Now, let me give an example. During the 2022, was it 2020 Black Lives Matter protests in the US, right? When George Floyd was killed, is that his name? When he was killed, and then BLM protests arose all over the country. Now, 93% of those protests were peaceful. That's a huge, staggering statistic, right? But the 7% that was not peaceful were the ones that kind of were put at the forefront of this particular protest, of the idea of the movement in general, right? And so the far right, those that opposed the Black Lives Matter movement, capitalized on that with their media and everything. They capitalized on those violence to claim they were anarchists, claim they were trying to overthrow the government. They made it such that the violent part, the 7%, became the face of a 93% peaceful protest that was holding in various other parts of the country. So violence is a way that it's a fragile thing because once violence enters a particular equation, it's so easy to bring in armed forces. It's so easy to bring in excuses and capitalize on reasons as to why these particular protesters, they do not have positive intent. And usually that cancels out the message that protesters are trying to raise. Another reason I don't, under the violence point, is that you don't have to hire anybody. Most often than not, when protesters are out on the streets and there are lots of people, businesses around are usually victims of looting, victims of some type of violence or another, because there are people within the crowd who just want to take advantage of the rowdiness, want to take advantage of the fact that there are many people out on the road and no one would notice if this was missing, and it would be hard to pinpoint exactly who stole this and who stole that. So more often than not, roadside businesses, there are people within these protests that suffer certain consequences, right? And because of looters and other people with less than ideal interests that are taking advantage of the protest. Now, another thing with protests, and this is the major one I have, it's not the biggest, but it's a major one. The fact that most protests do not have a clear goal or a clear purpose. Now, sometimes, not sometimes, it happens often that people come out to the street, a particular thing happens, and people come out onto the streets, and something bad that happens is so emotional. They're so emotional that they do not present a proper problem. They do not suggest a proper, rather, solution to the problem that they want. Say for example, when the mass kidnappings happened in schools, that period where it was just hot everybody's head. And it's still something we are looking forward to, by the way. It's still a huge topic, but there was a time where it was particularly big. The kidnappings of students in schools. I'm talking too fast. The kidnappings of students in schools, right? During that period, if we had taken to the streets and just said, bring back our children, and that was the only action that was taken en masse, like the entire Nigeria, this is happening, it would have been very hard to get actual solution out of that protest because it's too vague. Bring back our children, granted, who is bringing back the children? We are usually these things, we look at the president only, but is it the president that will bring back the children? Will the president use his hand and walk there to bring back the children? There needs to be like a clear path of action for protests like this in order for us to see actual results at the end of it. Say, for example, let me give you a good example of this one. The End SARS protest. It's as simple as that. End SARS. We want this SARS to end. But now the goal behind the End SARS protest was police brutality, right? If we had gone out on the street and said, end police brutality, it would have been a lot more difficult for us to achieve the end of that police brutality in the way we achieved the end of SARS. Meanwhile, police brutality, granted, it was the purpose of the SARS protest, but police brutality is a much broader subject. Police brutality is it's a lot more vague and ambiguous to hold down and, oh, this is how we end police brutality, right? But with NSAS, it was, we want these people that have a raging habit of abusing people on the road for absolutely no reason, just to their comfort. We want these people gone, right? That was NSAS. It was simple as that, clear message, and it got delivered. If we go out on the road and we say end bad governance, is, there are how many senators? 300 senators. How many people in the House of Rep? 300 and something. How many ministers? How many commissioners? How many local government chairmen? How many ward councillors? Is that what they call them? All those bits and pieces are all governance. Where do you want to start ending the bad governance from? All right. So protests need clear intent. We need to be able to properly decide, or rather define, what it is that we want to get out of a particular protest. That is one of the hugest, is that a word? Biggest indicators of whether or not a protest will be successful or not. For me anyways. Usually when I hear of people going out for protest, I look at exactly what it is that they want to achieve at the end of this protest, and that's how I know whether this thing will be worth it or not. And I'm not going to lie, a lot of the protests I've been seeing online, there was one that had clear intent. I loved that. And I knew that they would get what they wanted out of that protest. And then there were others that were just too vague with no clear path of action. And I just knew that it would not be going anywhere. Now, mind you, protests are really great. As I mentioned before, they provide pressure, right? Provide pressure and visibility to a particular issue or a particular topic that we want to explore or talk about. Protests do this. It is not bad to protest. It's a democratic right to have our feelings known. All right. This pressure and visibility is like coming out in numbers, letting the particular interest that we're protesting against know that look, this is how we feel about these things, and this is the number of people that you've gotten angry with this particular action that you took. All right. So protests are good for that. But I feel like what needs to accompany a protest is clear intent. Decide what you want to get out of that process. And this one is also important. It's really nice if there are people who, within a particular system, within the protests. Sorry, people who are part of the protests, but also within the system that can afford this change. So that while we're out on the streets putting pressure, they're the ones inside the rooms that matter. They're the ones talking about how, look, this is how we get them what they want, coming to resolutions, negotiations, and all of that. And usually protests have leaders like that. But like I said, it's also very easy for those ideologies to be hijacked. So it's best to have people in those rooms making having those conversations about the actual change that can happen. There's one more thing I wanted to bring up. I forget it now, but it's big. Anyways, one thing I'll say about Nigerians is that okay, yes, this is it. Why we need protests are good, like I mentioned, but there's a reason why we need to be careful with how we protest. Usually, there's like a certain emotion that rages in us the first time that we uh, feel like this thing has been done and this thing is bad. Say, for example, the killing that triggered the NSAS protest. Now, imagine if we had classified it as police brutality and then we started the protest. The second wave of emotions that would have overridden us as we tried to, like protest that particular police brutality, it would have been less. Right. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that we need to get it right the first time because the second time, it will not be as potent, it will not be as strong. So that first time that this particular protest is happening, let's say that we have the right intent. The right intent is very important. We have the right intent. We are reaching out, the organizers of the protests are reaching out to people that have actual say in making the changes that we want, right? Have a clear line of action. There was one protest like this that I heard about. When I saw the demands of the protesters, I was like, this protest is not going to work because you are just standing there and you are shouting and you are begging. You're practically begging, actually, even though you're shouting and you're screaming, you're practically begging for these terms to be met because you hold no leverage whatsoever over these people that you're protesting against. All they have to do is just sit in their seats and wait for you to get tired of talking. Wait for life to get to you because Nigeria is hard. Nobody is going to stay out of work for more than 1 week, right? Although there are people that could do that. But they know that you eventually have to get back to your house, sit down in your house and think about life or whatever it is that you need to do, right? So we need to be able to, whatever protests that we're bringing out, there needs to be clear consequences presented and a clear like path of action that look, this is what we need to be done, this is what we want to be done, and this is what will happen if you don't give us what we want. All right. Yeah. So that's basically it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Again, I'm Arizuru and I'm building a community of thinkers and doers. So please follow along if you're into that. And let me know what you think. I'd like to have discussions all day long about this particular topic. If you have a different opinion, if you have something to add, let me know. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.